Hello and welcome back. You're not alone. That's our message today. We're talking about the ego and spirit, and we're not alone. You're not alone. So, why is this a relevant topic of conversation? Well, we often feel that we are. Depending on the part of the world that you come from, there are different ways of expressing the idea that we feel like it's us against the world sometimes, don't we? Like we're all alone. We're the only one experiencing suffering. We're the only one doing this. We're the only one doing that. We feel isolated and alone all the time in the world. And we are not. Really, you're not. In fact, it's impossible. So, my hope in offering this particular message today is that you take heart in it. You take some comfort, even if it's just a little bit, however minimal, really. I hope that you take some comfort in knowing that being alone, really alone, is not possible. May feel possible, but it's not. So, what you choose to do with this idea is completely up to you, of course. In the text of A Course in Miracles, we're in chapter 4, section 2, the ego and false autonomy. We've been looking at several very unflattering ideas about ourselves because we identify with the ego. We think we're individual self-sustaining survival units. And in the first few paragraphs of this section, Jesus, not so flatteringly, likens us to animals, defining and defending personal territory with their own offspring, like a mama bear, for example, comes to mind. We're also likened in these first few paragraphs to a baby. How's that for flattering? A baby playing with a pair of scissors or a knife, a sharp object, and we wail and scream in rage when an adult comes and takes that sharp object away from us, knowing that we're going to slice ourselves. Yet we're still enraged. Yeah, this is identifying with the ego here. And the ego believes that it's on its own. That's the foundation of it. So believing it's completely isolated, an individual, a self-sustaining survival unit, believing it's on its own, this produces an immediate terror, abject terror that the ego's always trying to deal with, to work with. Doesn't want to feel abject terror. Nobody wants to feel abject terror. So what the ego does is it attempts to relate to other egos, either in a quid pro quo negotiation style of giving and receiving, where if you give me something, I'll give you something else, that type of thing, where there's always a compromise or a negotiation or an exchange. So it engages in that behavior, or it engages in out and out attack, assault, warfare. It's the expression of fear. In fact, the ego is fear. It's also a simple mistake. It's a simple mistake. It's the mind's belief that it's completely on its own. So it's the mind's belief that it is independently existing and is not connected to anything or anyone, not connected to anyone else, and not connected to its source, not connected to God. Isolated, alone, adrift on an infinite sea of bad things coming to get you. That's what the ego is. And it's a complete mistake. So, of course, the ego, when you hear that it's a mistake, it's not real, of course, there is going to be some resistance. The ego naturally resists these ideas because it is correct in one thing. It is itself a mistake, doesn't exist. It's correct in that you are eventually going to set it aside. You're going to make a choice that you no longer need or want it. And rather than kick it in the face and make a thing of it, you simply acknowledge that it's nothing and leave it gently to the side. It disappears. It's correct in its terror that you will set it aside. When, that's up to you. It can be right now. It can be in the next 15 minutes, or it can be in 15 lifetimes or more. It's entirely up to you. What each and every one of us has is the opportunity right now to set the ego aside. We have the opportunity right now to choose the thought system of the Holy Spirit instead of the ego's pain and isolation and suffering. We have the opportunity to choose love instead of fear. We have the opportunity to choose our reality as spirit instead of the ego. This is how we use our mind here in the world. Notice mind singular, not minds plural. There's one mind, and we use it to choose our reality as spirit. Because we're not alone. Again, the ego is a simple mistake. This idea that we exist separately and that we're isolated in any way is simply not true. That we behave as though we believe it is true. And in fact, we believe it's true here in the world until we decide we've had enough of the suffering that this belief has caused ourselves and others, until we decide we're done and we say that we want the peace of God. So we seek the peace of God and we discover along the way, we call it a journey, we call it a path, but we discover along the way that there's nowhere to go. We're actually not going anywhere because the peace of God is ours. It's who we are. We don't actually have to seek it, but what we do is we clear the obstacles to our awareness of this. We lift the veil, so to speak. We take down the wall, if you prefer that analogy. We walk through a thick, imposing-looking fog bank to discover its complete unsubstantiality. It's completely insubstantial. It's nothing. It's a passing cloud, literally. This is what we're doing on what we call a spiritual journey or the spiritual path. Whatever the outward manifestation looks like. Again, I say this, yes, this is a video about A Course in Miracles. This is what we're talking about here. Yet it applies to each and every one of us. No matter what the outward form of our practice may look like. I'm fond of saying there are many doors in spirituality, and there are. That accounts for the vast array of different spiritual traditions and practices. So you don't have to be an adherent to one of the world's traditional religions. You don't have to be an adherent to anything at all in order to derive benefit from this video, because the content of it is universal. We've all identified as the ego with an ego. We're all setting it aside. And in truth, it never existed in the first place. We never actually even needed to set it aside. Why? The separation never occurred. Spirit and ego are not even aware of one another. So while the ego runs amok and attempts to garner approval from other egos, and when it doesn't get it, it attacks them, or it attacks them hoping to somehow push another ego into submission in many, many different forms. While it does that, spirit, our reality, is completely unaware of the ego. So the ego seeks approval and deep down knows that there is something higher than itself, but it doesn't know what. And it fears that you'll leave it aside in favor of that other. And in that, it is correct. Just that, only that. Spirit's not even aware of ego. We've never left our source. So yes, all of this is in fact a dream from which we're waking up. That's what we're doing as we embark on what we call the spiritual path, removing the barriers to our awareness of truth. Removing the barriers to truth, removing the barriers to who we are. The Course calls it to the awareness of love's presence. Yes. Yeah. And the ego is fond of trying to figure out where it came from. It's fond of mythology. This is paragraph 9 of this section. It's fond of pondering the question based on the past, where did this thing come from? And of course, it associates itself with the physical body, hence all of our creation myths, where we were spoken into existence, or we were molded from clay, or we sprung from an ear of corn, or whatever the particular mythology says. It's a creation story. Every culture has one. It's the ego's attempt to explain itself. It's the ego's attempt to explain itself. And sometimes it goes beyond the physical body to this thing that is known as a soul. So let's talk about one other thing here. That's also an ego idea. Oh, I know. It is. Think about it. How a soul is depicted is individual, is it not? My soul. People talk about a soul, whatever that is, as mine, as his, yours. It's an ego idea, just like the human body. It just doesn't appear in bodily form in our mythology. In fact, when I was going to fundamentalist Sunday school, people would talk about the soul and saving one's soul. And I was, in fact, as you may know from past videos, that kid that asked these questions. What's a soul? What is that? I wanted to know. And not one of the adults was able to produce what to me was a satisfactory answer. So I would spend large periods of Sunday school time just totally quiet, and I would have fits of asking the imponderable questions. That, by the way, A Course in Miracles answers perfectly well. But I didn't know that then. No, I was a kid, and this was the 1980s. And while the course existed, I certainly didn't know about it. It would be years before I would even hear of A Course in Miracles. But at the time, I would alternate between the questions and just sitting there thinking about something else. I would think about a football game. I would think about dinner. I would think about how when I got home from this boring Sunday school lesson that I was going to eat that last slice of pizza before my sister got to it, and you know, that sort of young person thing. So meanwhile, Spirit is completely unconcerned with all of this ego drama. It doesn't even know about the ego. So there's your answer to, did God create the world? No. I mean, maybe you've heard that before. If you're a course student, then odds are you're familiar with this idea. We made the world. God did not create the world. The central teaching of A Course in Miracles is there is no world. Now, don't expect the ego to wrap its loving arms around that idea. This is likely, especially if you're hearing it for the first time, to produce resistance. Expect that. That is part of what we call the spiritual path. When we're setting the ego aside, we can bet that there are going to be moments where the ego resists, many moments where it resists and loudly. In fact, you may be tempted to hurl an F-bomb laced tirade at the image on your screen, but it's only an image on your screen. What's landing for you? Whatever is landing and resonating with you that has kept you watching this video all the way through is your inner teacher. When something makes sense to us, or we get an intuitive hit, or it connects somehow, it resonates, it lands, whatever that looks like, that's your inner teacher talking to you. And of course, your inner teacher wants you to pay attention. But understand that it's not going to bludgeon you into it, right? We have free will that cannot be taken away from us. So Jesus, the Holy Spirit, don't just swoop in and make us instantly, boom, enlightened. It's not the way it works. Part of our training, if you will, part of our learning or unlearning, as it is here on the path, is to appreciate the power of mind. Appreciate that it really can make a world. Having made the world, it can unmake it. It can recognize its complete insubstantiality, its nothingness. Now, we all still appear to be here. So what do we do while we still appear to be here? Entertain these ideas, for starters. That's huge. To entertain these ideas that go completely against the ego's thought system and, in fact, help us to find our way home, so to speak. Again, there's no place to go, but it helps us to clear our perception. That's the goal of this course. In practice, we connect with our inner teacher, and under our inner teacher's guidance, we practice what is known in this course as true forgiveness, as forgiveness of the Son of God, overlooking error, whatever your forgiveness practice is and looks like. So again, we're not forgiving what our brother did to us. There is no other. There's only perfect oneness. There's never been any separation of any kind. So true forgiveness contains some seed of acknowledgement. It's more of an attitude than a formulaic list, for sure, because it looks differently every time you do it, depending on who or what you're forgiving. We're actually forgiving an appearance. Our brother, an appearance for what it did not do. It didn't do anything. Our brother did not actually do anything to us. There's never been any separation of any kind. So we're forgiving what is, in fact, an outer image on our screen, so to speak. It's like watching a movie, a 3D movie that feels real and that we believe is real until we're done with the suffering that that belief entails. And we begin to entertain these ideas that, in fact, it's not real, never has been, and never will be. And that means, in conclusion, that you're not alone. You're not alone. You're never alone. We're never alone. So I invite you, in whatever way seems most appropriate and resonant to you, to get in touch with your inner teacher and ask your inner teacher for guidance. Yeah, do that. That's the essence of the practice of spirituality. In doing this, that helps us to set the ego aside. We're saying, I don't know everything. Guide me. All right. So the subscription button's right over here. I'd love to have you join me. If you've not subscribed yet, please feel welcome to do so. These videos appear several times a week here on YouTube, and also in my data here, you'll find the link to my Patreon page where I have a weekly live stream where we can go into more depth on these ideas. So if that's something that you're interested in, I invite you to check that out. And as always, comments and questions are most welcome here. Absolutely. And if you've got questions, please feel free to ask. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me. I will talk to you all very soon.